Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm going to give a few moments to just let everybody settle in a little bit. So I can introduce myself in the interim, and then we'll get more to the formal program. I wanted to give Maggie a chance to start to live stream. Oh, we've got live stream. I am not stressing then. Watch how that stress dissipated. So this is a social media friendly space though, so I do want to let you know, feel free to take pictures and with permission check in with their folks before you go putting too much up, but feel free to talk about what we talked about today and to share that information with others. It's always a great day to gather. So we'll begin. So hi everyone, good evening. Thank you for coming out on this gorgeous day. It was originally predicted to have pretty nasty storms, but congressmen came through and they said, all right, let's show them what New Hampshire really looks like on a beautiful day. So excited to be here with you. My name's Kiah Morris. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Executive Director for Rights and Democracy. Before we go any further with our wonderful program with Congressman Khanna today, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement, and then we can get into a little bit of what we're going to do so you'll have a sense of what the event's going to feel like. So I'd like to begin with this land acknowledgement. Rights and Democracy acknowledges the Mohican in southern Vermont and the Abenaki peoples as the traditional caretakers of Indakana, which includes parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, New England, and Quebec. As guests on the unceded territory of the Mohican and the Abenaki peoples, we honor their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge that our nation has benefited from the uncompensated and exploited labor represented in the legacy of slavery and the present-day reality of migrant farm workers. So we're very fortunate to have this opportunity to be here, and I want to extend a little bit of the land acknowledgement as some of the wonderful guides like Beverly Little Thunder and others have taught me to use the land acknowledgement as a chance to recognize the exact place in which we are, and recognizing both the beautiful green of the beauty that's happening, but then the dangers that we had earlier this season with the gypsy moths threatening to take away all of the beautiful foliage and set us back months into what we need for a necessary ecosystem to thrive. We're here on lands that are not only unceded, but are not that far from where we've seen nuclear power plants and coal plants and other means of extractive industries that have threatened the entire ecosystem, including all living beings, including humans, in this space, and how delicate and precious it is. But we are fortunate to have the sun and seasonably warm little August weather in June, but we know that's a part of the global warming that we're all trying to combat at this time. So thank you for joining me for the land acknowledgement and recognizing where we are today and the work we have as stewards for that land. So I am so excited to be joined here by Congressman Khanna, who is joining us here and has been in long partnership with Rights and Democracy as an organization for many years. When I first came on to Rights and Democracy, I had the pleasure of being on a discussion with the Congressman as we were talking about and launching our big, bold climate initiatives, which we know are also based on multi-faceted crises, overlapping crises. So anything we talk about in the environmental sphere has economic implications, and we know about the economic crisis that we're all suffering under. It has everything to do with how we are dealing with systemic racism and its role that it's played in both displacing indigenous persons, the exploited labor that's used to continue to fuel our extractive industries, and in so many other ways. And we also can see where it also impacts our schools, it impacts our homes, our communities, every single component of our lives. So it was so exciting to be a part of that conversation with Congressman when he was just so excited to help support Rights and Democracy as an organization and stepping to that forefront. So for those who don't know, Rights and Democracy is a now 6-year-old organization that is by state. We cover both Vermont and New Hampshire, and we are a nonprofit organization that's focused on grassroots power and building grassroots power to win the issue fights that are of importance to us. So we're out knocking doors, talking to your neighbors, having close conversations with people in community, as well as doing work to try to get our champions in office so those decision-making places are seated with the voices of those most impacted. So that is why it is just such a pleasure to have this conversation with the Congressman today, as we're going to talk about the real misnomers and the opportunities and the calls to action to address our economic crisis in some really innovative ways. So we're going to start with some questions that we have to talk about Congressman Khanna's book, Dignity in the Digital Age. If you do not have it, you can find it many places, as well on audiobooks. I suggest you give it a listen and a read. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about some issues that are both important to New Hampshire and the nation. And we will have an opportunity. We'll have a few folks that may have some questions, if you'd like to be able to share them, depending on the time and where we're at. So I want to thank you, and I'd love to say welcome.
Thank you, Kiah. Thank you very much. Let's give Kiah a round of applause. What an incredible, dynamic, visionary leader, and you're off to a great start. And I want to thank Ed. Ed, thank you for your leadership, and thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you to all of you. What you're doing at Rights and Democracy is building progressive power. And that is absolutely necessary to counter the unfettered capitalism, corporate power, to counter some of the entrenched interests in our own party and in Congress, to counter big oil, big pharma, defense contractors. So I love that you're not just organizing, you're not just active, you're not just proposing ideas, that you're actually building power. And we on our progressive side shouldn't be afraid of that term. That's what we need to do to help return to the values for the people. So thank you for inviting me, really honored.
Thank you so much. And what you just said really strikes a chord with this particular moment in time where people are reeling from the decisions that are coming from the Supreme Court. And so when I think about building that progressive power and why it's necessary, these economic conversations are often at the root of why people are able to latch on to particularly harmful ideologies that are rooted in a racism and a capitalistic kind of way of thinking of who we are as individuals and how we work as a nation. So I'm excited to get into some critical conversations on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have a court that has a crisis of legitimacy, much like we had courts in other times in our history. Lincoln had to deal with a court, the Dred Scott Court, that had a crisis of legitimacy. The Plessy versus Ferguson Court had a crisis of legitimacy. You now have a court that wants to control women. That's what this is about. This is not about life or an ideology. This is about control. And you have 6 unelected people who are totally out of touch with modern life in American society. I've called for retroactive term limits so that we can get some fundamental court change and that we can discuss other ideas, and we got to get rid of the filibuster, and we've got to codify Roe versus Wade. But the only thing that beat the previous times the court has been illegitimate is mobilized citizen power. And ultimately, it's we the people that get to decide on rights, not the Supreme Court. I don't want to belabor the point, but they say the Supreme Court is a check on majoritarian impulse, which is correct, but that doesn't mean that the Supreme Court can be out to lunch and totally disconnected from American culture and American life.
Thank you. And well, the thing about the Supreme Court is we're going to talk about what happens locally, where we start to see these divisions being sown, as well as the rhetoric that goes around who we are and how we consider personhood and citizenry. But it began on a local level. It began because there were people in Rust Belt areas, in places where industry is missing, where they've seen that rural communities have not been supported. And it made it very easy to get behind those in power who created a whole pathway for exactly where we are today. So that is, in many ways, for me, why your conversation is so critical right now as well, because we missed that. We missed that opportunity to unify as a country.
I couldn't agree more, Kiah. And I do want to also just thank Stonewall Farm for hosting us, and Shannon Jackson for helping. And I have to share that my last memory of being here was Bernie Sanders standing with thousands of people in a packed room, and I thought, wow, the progressive revolution really has begun, and it has begun, yes. And we shouldn't underestimate what we achieved. But I think to your point, Look, there was a lot to the rise of the right wing, and some of it has to do pure explicit xenophobia and racism and misogyny. But there was also an element to it where we presided as a country over the deindustrialization of so much of this country. Because of corporate greed, we said it didn't matter. Let the jobs go offshore, let millions of jobs go offshore. Industry was decimated. As my district in Silicon Valley has made $10 trillion, other places have been left totally behind. The middle class in this country has lost 25% of its wealth since 1985. You know what the bottom 50% in this country, how much wealth they own? Any guess? 2%? 2%? 72% in the top 10%? The racial wealth gap in this country is increasing, not decreasing. And that's because you can't tackle the racial wealth gap if you don't tackle the racial wealth generation gap. And this was both parties. This was leadership on both sides that said production doesn't matter. Making things doesn't matter. And then when the jobs went offshore, we said, go move. People don't want to move. Some people do. I moved from Bucks County to Silicon Valley, fine. But a lot of people want to stay in their hometown. They want to build in their hometown. And so part of our mission, part of what I've been doing, part of the book, is about going to communities. I've been in Jackson State in Mississippi. I've been to Claflin in South Carolina. I've been to in Illinois, Galesburg, where the Maytag factory left, saying, what are we going to do to revitalize these places? And in my case, because I come from technology, we've been trying to create some of the partnerships where these tech companies are partnering with HBCUs, community colleges in Manchester, paying a $5,000 stipend, 18-month course, getting a $65,000 job. But it doesn't just have to be that. We could be making the new battery factories, the clean steel. We can be making the new industries, solar farms, build manufacturing, build production. And by the way, Donald Trump doesn't have any vision for that. What was his vision? Corporate tax cuts, bash the Mexicans, and bash the Chinese. That was really, and my view, you go in there, where are the new factories? Where are the new jobs? Our vision, which was FDR's vision, is you have massive government support for businesses to produce. That's how we won World War II. And we can do this across America, and we can do this in communities left out. And that, to me, has to be the democratic, one of the central democratic messages. Do I think economic revival, a jobs revolution will solve racism, sexism? No. But do I think it gives us a better chance of stitching this country together? Absolutely.
Correct. Thank you. Well, so that's so powerful in thinking about how that ties in to the role that you play within Congress. What were those initial pullings that brought you into saying elected office is where I want to go? Politics is the space that I need to leverage my voice within.
Well, I originally probably wanted to be a human rights lawyer and work at the United Nations. My grandfather spent 4 years in jail in the 1940s alongside Gandhi as part of India's independence movement, and that was my inspiration. He spent 15 years of his life fighting for Indian independence. And my parents immigrated from India. I was born in Philadelphia in 1976, our bicentenary. And when I was young, I thought, okay, how do I have some impact on human rights, on international justice, on a more just foreign policy? But what really brought me into politics is I was moved out to Silicon Valley, and the congressman there had voted for the Iraq War and had voted for the Patriot Act. And I was 27 years old, and at that time, you may not remember this, but basically any South Asian male, you had advanced security screening every time you went through the airports. And so I said, this is crazy. In the Bay Area, a Democratic member of Congress is for the war in Iraq. And, you know, Tom Lantos ended up becoming someone who became a mentor. He was the only Holocaust survivor at the time in Congress. And people said, Ro, if you run against him, you're destroying your career before it begins. And I ran in 2003 as one of the first, I think the first anti-war Iraq war primaries in the country. And for repealing the Patriot Act, I got killed. I got 19% of the vote. But Lantos, you know, recognized he was wrong in the war. He actually introduced me to other people in the party. And the lesson I took from that is that no one can predict democracy, but if you do what you think is right, you have the best shot of at least being true to who you are. And that's what really got me started in politics.
Well, so then when you get in there, you see how what happens behind the curtain, as we always like to say, well, how the sausage is made, right? So you see and you feel that constant tug and that constant pull. So figuring out where you're going to have your impact is truly important, because it can't just be on you, nor can it be on, it takes each and every person who holds one of those seats to say, this is what I can bring in order to make it work, because it's just entirely too much work. So how did you find yourself building a focus around thinking about tech industry and tech jobs as a leverage point to help build bridges and build political power?
For me, it wasn't just about technology jobs. It was a lack of focus on place. And I said, how is it that the polling in my district shows that young kids are totally optimistic about America? I mean, that's so rare. And partly it's because they have the opportunity to go do different things. And why is it that as our country we have totally neglected places where there was deindustrialization? I was in Galesburg, Illinois, where the Maytag factory left. And 20 years later, President Obama eloquently spoke about it. 20 years later, 20 folks from that factory met with me, and they said, our kids are still leaving. There are no jobs. Nothing has happened. I went down to some of the HBCUs, which have been completely left out of the wealth generation of the innovation economy. And I said, how is it that our country is not focused on the economic empowerment of people and places left out of globalization in a 21st century economy? And so my focus was two things. One, how do we bring production back to this country? And that, in my view, requires government, because there is no way we can have the capital expenditure to just leave it to the private sector. Right. And we should have been taxing companies. It's one thing to move production offshore to sell offshore, but we should have had a tax if you're moving production offshore to sell back into the United States. We didn't. That led to a lot of deindustrialization, and then we added insult to injury by not creating any economic new production there, new economic activity there. And then in communities like the Latino and the black community, one of the things, obviously we have to talk about voting rights. Obviously we have to talk about the fact you shouldn't go out on the street and get shot by a cop. But we never talk about, well, what are we going to do to have a job? What are you going to do to have a business? What are we going to do to build wealth? And that I found that was a totally missing part of the Democratic platform. And so this is why I started to bring these tech companies, but ultimately it's not about just tech. It's about how do we create economic activity so that we can have people flourishing in their communities, in their hometowns if they want, and as people. And then we can talk about all the things that go into that, such as having Medicare for all, health care for all, making sure people aren't having medical debt, making sure people don't have $30,000 of loans, but ultimately in a vision of being productive, creative human beings. That's what we want.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about, so when we're thinking about the industrial, we're thinking about technology, we're thinking about the industrial companies coming into some of these areas to create a different type of economy and a different type of work and job opportunities. We don't automatically assume that the skills and the expertise are in rural areas, are in places that are not centered within urban settings. What have you found from your work with regards to these communities coming back into themselves and people seeing and feeling themselves as saying, yes, I believe I can still have part of this American dream. It just looks different than it did before.
That's a great question. First of all, we have to overcome the myth that these are somehow all coding jobs and software engineering jobs. A lot of these are manufacturing jobs. They are retail jobs. They are agriculture jobs, but they require some competency of technology. And in the 90s, maybe they required advanced coding and college degrees. But now, when there are 25 million of these digital jobs in all sectors, you can have a 9-month credential, a 12-month credential, and do them. And so one of the things I talk about in the book with Alex Hughes is he's working for a manufacturer making refrigerators, but he had a credential to getting the electronic technology, because these refrigerators have a sensor on them, and that's what he's doing. But he can relate to that because his father and grandfather made stuff. And so instead of describing it as, oh, this is some techie job, you can describe this as this is a manufacturing job. A car is just a computer on wheels. What are those jobs going to look like? Retail, you have to have some technology proficiency. And so part of this can be done in rural communities if you have the community colleges or land-grant universities or HBCUs working with the industry to give the credential and then to hire people. And if we expand our sense of where talent is, but these networks have been closed. I was working with Claflin, which is an HBCU down in South Carolina, and they kept sending 4.0 students to this tech company, and they kept rejecting them. And then they realized that these students hadn't done a, quote, whiteboard interview, which is just a form of interviewing where people go on the whiteboard and ask questions and go back and forth. But it was a cultural barrier because the tech company didn't realize that folks hadn't been exposed, and the students didn't know that this existed. And they don't have a network, whereas a lot of the folks who were getting funded have a network. I used to teach economics at Stanford, and I used to joke my students had funding before they had an idea. But you could have, that's true. And yet all these other people who are just as brilliant ideas aren't getting funded. So the point of, I think, this is that we have got to democratize the job creation and wealth generation of the digital economy, but we also have to bring back the production and make things in America again, which has devastated factory towns, and it's devastated a lot of the Black South. And you look at William Julius Wilson's work. I don't know if you're familiar, Truly Disadvantaged, where he talked about the job loss because of manufacturing leaving in black inner cities. And then you read Debts of Despair, which is the opioid crisis and suicidal thoughts in rural America because of job loss. And it's almost like they're writing about the exact same thing. This is happening in black communities, this is happening in white communities, because both places have been neglected in terms of a lot of the industrialization. So my view is you can actually build a coalition around having dignified jobs, economic opportunity, production, high wages across this country, and say it's time to build the working and middle class again. And we're not going to put up with a country that has just massive hoarding of wealth without others having opportunity. The other point I want to make, because I supported Bernie Sanders representing Silicon Valley, and I want to just be clear about this. No one represents more billionaires than I do. If I can be for a wealth tax, if I can be for a wealth tax and keep getting elected to Congress, I don't see how every other member of Congress can't be for that. I don't get it. I mean, if you have more billionaires than your districts, then raise your hand. Otherwise, the guy who's representing all these people is saying tax them. Yeah. How difficult is it? They're not going to move their money to China or Russia. Come on, give me a break. They're going to keep it in the United States. It's still the best place to make money. We made more money than ever before. We can afford to invest in our communities.
So I love that, and I want to go in two directions. I'm a little off script, but just go. So I'm thinking about what this means from an economic perspective. I'm always going from the local to the large, right? So there's two things that we have as an opportunity to build in progressive policy and in the design of bringing this sort of industry and work into different areas. The first being that the people who are most impacted by our economic crises, by our climate crises, are overwhelmingly people of color. There are folks from the disability community. We definitely know that there's that economic, the wealth gap that we keep speaking about that's there. How do we create mechanisms that ensure those individuals will get the first crack, not just at the jobs, but at the opportunities? So if I'm saying we're building a solar plant here, how do we ensure that it's BIPOC folks that are the ones that get to do the trainings? They're the ones that get to be the trainers that are making the wealth to create this new workforce. How do we ensure that even in installation companies, folks who are using cooperative economic models, that gets down to the smaller level, and still also addresses that people have an American dream of individualism, but it's still often based in a desire, not always to just be a worker. because our people get pushed out of the workforce, but also to have the ability to create economic freedom for themselves. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if we're thinking about the big picture, fine, we get the company here. Now, how do we make sure we've mobilized in a way that keeps our folks that have a vision for smaller business or for their own means of entrepreneurialism within that to have a shot at doing so? Because you have a caution about bigger companies coming in that I want to get to in a minute. So I'd love to hear your other thoughts.
Well, we have to be intentional.
Right.
We have to be intentional. One of the reasons that Silicon Valley has been so exclusive on race and gender, some of it may be explicit discrimination, but I think a large part of it is non-intentionality. When they're so focused on growing as a startup, they don't look at hiring beyond what is simple and easy. There's no intentionality, and they don't understand that after 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, the lack of intentionality will replicate patterns of exclusion. And so what can the federal government do? Well, we can start by being intentional about who we hire in federal contracts on vendors. Look at what Maynard Jackson did in Atlanta. He was very intentional about making sure that the business was going to community, to black and brown and business owners. We aren't doing that in a federal contracting space. In Jackson, Mississippi, just because I was there in Lumumba, Mayor Lumumba told me that only in a majority African American city, only 11% of the contracts go to black business owners. So we have to be intentional, at least with the levers of government, to say, okay, if we're going to have so much funding for these new technology initiatives for clean technology, make sure that we have a appropriate diversity of people, business leaders, getting some of those resources. We need to provide incentives to diversify who's writing the venture capital checks. You know, there's less than 1% of the $120 billion of venture capital that goes to black and Latino women. Less than 1%. Now, how do we get more? We need the people writing the checks have to be more women and people of color. And that's how you get them writing checks to communities, their own communities. There are very few of those folks who are writing these checks. So let's have massive tax incentives for venture firms that are hiring women and black people to be writing the checks. Let's have a law in my state that have requirements on the boards of these companies. People say, oh, that's elitism. Why do you care just about the boards and not working folks? Because the boards make the decision, the companies will make the decision about where to give the business and who to fund, which ultimately do affect a lot of working families. We need to change the economics of the country to be more inclusive. And we need to be intentional about the hiring. I mean, the president could have a goal tomorrow, create 1 million black digital jobs and do this at HBCUs. And he could do this actually probably without even congressional legislation. He could just convene these tech companies and say, here, let's create these partnerships. You know, one of the saddest things to me has been that black and brown young people are disproportionately invested in cryptocurrencies. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be invested in cryptocurrency. There's some crypto blockchain that will succeed. But I was talking to them and some of the young folks of why that is, and they said we totally missed the wealth generation of the technology revolution. This is at least our way of building some value. Well, you know what? They should have more options to build value and wealth than going and buying cryptocurrency. That to me is a very sad situation, that that's the only way they feel that they are going to be part of modern wealth generation. So to your point, I think we need to be intentional in the federal spending, intentional about where the private spending is going and the structure of these private companies. And one more point, I have a bill, an innovation bill, that would fund massive new innovation across America. It's leading to Intel investing in Columbus to create new semiconductor manufacturing. I have explicitly put in that bill that they have to look at places that are black and brown to put those innovation centers. You can't just expect those centers to be in Silicon Valley and expect the hiring to work. You have to have them in some of the Black South. You have to have them in other parts of the country. So yes, we have to look at things from a perspective of class, but we also have to look at things from a perspective of race, because just talking about class does not overcome the 350 years of racial exclusion in this country. And my experience in Silicon Valley shows that that's the case.
I agree with you definitely on that, and that's a really important point to consider, because when I'm imagining this vision for this new place as we come into this work is to think about the entirety of the community, not just the entity that's there, but the entirety of making the community vibrant and not just based off of the workforce for that entity. Now, you had some cautions that you talked about in your book around what happens when municipalities, when states, when they get overly invested in creating incentives.
You really read the book. A lot of times I have people interviewing you, they've read the Amazon blurb before, like 10 minutes before.
Well, this is what you're articulating is something that many have felt. I lived in Seattle for a number of years, and I remember when the dot-com bubble was about to hit, I got out right before then, was able to sell off my pieces before I lost it all. But it was once more this joke that they used to have a billboard in Seattle that says, well, the last person to leave Seattle, yes, please turn out the lights. Yeah. Right? Because what would happen again and again, we saw this with Boeing and what they did in Chicago. We've seen this happen with many of these large firms where they come into the communities, they give the promise of economic growth, job growth, all these pieces, but then don't follow through and then bail. But we've also given them complete tax, like almost immunity in some ways, to be able to make that money and then cut and run. How do we fix this in real time?
Well, first of all, what Amazon did I thought was shameful. I don't know if there are any basketball fans, but it reminded me of when LeBron James did the lottery, where basically everyone around the country was trying to bid for him, and everyone was trying to bid for them with tax dollars. Well, the reality is, Enrico Moretti is an economist. He wrote The Geography of Jobs, and he makes a very compelling case that the best thing a community can do to attract companies and good companies and create jobs is to invest in education. It's not to give away your money on these tax breaks. Yes. And cities and states don't have those resources. Now, I believe that the federal government, when it comes to production and when it comes to opening plants and factories, that we should be helping certain companies produce things. But Amazon certainly doesn't need that. Amazon doesn't need that to start warehouses. I mean, if we want to be making battery plants and solar farms and critical industries, and we want to be doing that across the country, the federal government should do it in partnership with business and community colleges. But the federal government also has a lot more resources. States don't have that and cities don't have that. Mm-hmm. So the economics are pretty clear that the state giveaways and the city giveaways do not work. Right. But in part, I oppose them, but in part, I think of these mayors and these governors and what they're responding to. And that gets back to how we started. They're seeing no economic activity in their communities. They're not seeing these jobs. And so they're going through these desperate means to say help. And this is what they know. And that is why we need a national industrial strategy. That's why we need a federal government strategy to create jobs in places that have been left out. I view these almost as a cry for help. I sort of look at these mayors and say, they're saying, well, we need something. Mm-hmm. Bro, it's easy for you to talk about not having federal subsidies sitting in Silicon Valley. Look at our communities. Yeah. And that's why the response to that has to be a federal response of revitalization, of job creation, of attracting business at a national level that considers the geographical, racial equities in how we do it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I do have concerns. I have concerns about what this will feel like for us to hold these organizations and these entities accountable. I think the previous point that you made around like how are we looking at the distribution of opportunities, right? So it's not just that that in itself becomes an extractive industry, because then when it's gone, the devastation is major. And we also know that we've been dealing with pollution and things like that have happened from our industrial sector. And so people said, well, yeah, it's okay for me to work in the radioactive facility because I'm making a ton of money. So these are the things that we need to check and continue to hold as important while we're thinking about this growth. That also, so even if it brings the jobs and the opportunities, What we feel here, and I'm sure you've seen it in other places, is this dogged determination that we're doing it on our own. And it's not a NIMBY as much as it's a resistance to anything that changes the character of our communities, of these communities here in New Hampshire, of the communities here in Vermont and in New England, that have always had a certain quality to them. And this industrial boom brings in a whole lot of folks that bring resistance. So it becomes I feel like it becomes a split, again, economically and racially, to say for these communities, well, you want the money, but you don't really want the people, do you? Right? And so it creates a resistance. How do we have the people feel invested in a way that they can trust these processes of trying to bring tech, trying to bring new industry into their communities without the pitchforks?
I think it has to be a community-driven process. So I'll give the example of Manchester Community College or Claflin. If I had said, if Washington, D.C. or Silicon Valley said we're going to plop up some training center in this community and create jobs, there would have been resistance. But if it comes from the community itself, the local community college, the local mayor, and they are understanding of what the community wants. So they may say, okay, we want this, but we don't want too much. We want to make sure we have affordable housing, because if you have, one of the big problems in my district is we didn't have enough affordable housing. We don't want the financialization of the housing market, where you've got Blackstone or Wall Street firms buying up housing and then jacking up rents by 30, 40%. We want to make sure that if you come into the communities, that the service folks who will service you are going to be paid a fair wage, that the workers are going to have some representation on the boards. I think about this from the perspective of Amazon. You're a worker who gets a job at Amazon. And part of you thinks you've literally won the lottery. I mean, Amazon, in terms of the net worth, is $2 trillion. And then you can't get dignity? Mm-hmm. Then you can't, working for the richest company ever founded in the world, and you have a job there, and they're monitoring your bathroom breaks, and you have no autonomy, and you can't get paid a reasonable wage? That's just greed. That's just wrong policy. We have more wealth than we know what to do with in this country, and yet we don't have the dignity for a lot of the workers. So a community can decide on those parameters, on housing, on worker wages, on the service economy, and make those determinations for themselves. And I think this has to be very much community directed.
I'd love to hear if you have a good example of that, because a mechanism that happens so often is like the SEDS process, which gives an ability for communities to then get bonds, block grants and such, to try to help with their development. The problem is, though, we do this community outreach and engagement, and it still stays within the circles. So they warn it in the newspapers and say, we're going to talk about the economic future. 10 people show up, and that counts as community engagement. How can the federal government help us in better making sure that these processes are actually engaging the people most impacted, and not just doing so on a surface level? Because that's the difference, right?
Yeah, I can tell you it wasn't perfect, but when Google from my district wanted to move further south with new office space in San Jose, there was a lot of resistance. You're going to let more Google offices into San Jose with the rent already the way it is? That was crazy. And there was almost 2 years of community debate, and in the end they got Google to fund massively affordable housing. They got them to fund universal childcare. They got a lot of investments. Now, some people may still not be for it, but by and large there was a lot of consensus, and those investments were in largely Latino areas that were underrepresented in the tech industry. So when we are doing these types of industrial projects or innovative projects, I think it is incumbent for the people who are evaluating the federal grant that may allow it to take place to make sure that the voices that are being heard are inclusive of the community and that they're taking into account different things. Now, I will say that not every process should just be to stop things. I mean, there have been times where we need solar farms or we need lithium-ion processing, 80% of which is done in China, which we do want to build for the environmental movement. And sometimes it can be excessive to just say stop. And so the question is, where is that balance? But I think that it definitely needs to be heavily community directed. And my experience has been that communities tend to be pretty open and excited about having new jobs and new good paying jobs. So I don't think you're going to get, some places may not want it, but a lot of places would love that kind of opportunity, especially factory towns and places where you've seen the decimation of these jobs in west side of Chicago, Dayton, Milwaukee, Galesburg, other parts of the country.
So would you hold those as examples of just transition? Like that's a principle that we speak about a lot, thinking about what that means, going from extractive industries into green economy, going from downturn to helping people transition. Would you say that would be an example, or do you have an example that you were like, that was a good one?
I get the philosophy behind just transition. I don't love the term, and the reason I don't love it is because you're telling someone basically you're going to have to do something else that may not be quite as good, and we're going to compensate you. I'd rather inspire people. I'd rather say you're building the next lithium-ion processing in America is going to bring more prosperity to these communities and your kids than you've ever seen before. Building the new batteries, building the new semiconductors, building the new industries is going to revitalize these towns. So it becomes not, oh, you're giving something up and we're going to compensate you, but you're going to have all of this new opportunity, and your kids are going to have new opportunities, and it's going to bring more prosperity, and it's going to excite people. Mm-hmm. Just transitions is sort of seems to be the speaking of language of, well, this isn't that great, but we're going to compensate you, as opposed to we're going to together build the future of America. Mm-hmm. And I think people respond to an inspiring vision, and then it has to have details. I mean, then you can direct, more of the funding to places that have traditionally relied on fossil fuels. I think, one of the proposals I made is that we should have disproportionate funding go to towns that have had auto plants shut down to build the new electric vehicles. We should have disproportionate funding for new investments go to places that have been dependent on fracking or dependent on coal to build the new industries. Mm-hmm. But that, I would describe that as building new opportunity, new prosperity, new industry, not as something that is taking away, which is I think some of why the rhetoric or it fails to connect in those communities.
Interesting. I want to give us a chance to allow for some folks from the audience to give some questions, if we may. Did anyone have any questions they wanted to share? You want to use the mic?
I think there's a mic here.
Just talk.
Okay.
There's also somebody in the chat. You want to hear that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, my name is Dag Hoekestokje. I'm originally from Iceland, but but I work for Rights and Democracy and Field Manager in New Hampshire.
Thank you.
So I was thinking about what you were saying, like intentionality and then giving people hope. And I wanted to say that, we did that in Iceland, and now we have, the strongest parliament of women, because it was intentional. It didn't just happen, But then I was also going to ask you about the production of, like you were talking about electrical vehicles, creating all the batteries. And I've heard that a lot of people feel like, that's not for them. Why should we be the ones who are creating this when we can't even afford to buy an electric vehicle? But how can you combine this, like creating hope for people, like we're creating all these jobs and we're creating all these electrical vehicles, but is it for us too?
That's a great point, and that was Henry Ford's great insight, that we needed to mass produce to be able to have people afford them. And I think that we have to have a massive investment in battery technology, in lithium-ion processing, and other industries that go into the electric vehicles to first bring the price down of these cars, because you can't, even the cheapest car is right now about $35,000, and that's out of reach for most Americans. And then we have to figure out, how do we lower the price? How do we make sure that we're increasing wages by having unionization, these jobs being good union jobs of people who are working in the manufacturing of it, and that the service jobs around that, because you're not just going to have everyone in manufacturing. It's still a predominantly service-driven economy. But how do we raise the wages of the service jobs? I'll tell you one thing very concretely we're doing in California that I'm part of, which is the AB 257 campaign for fast food workers. It turns out that, you know, even though we have this $10 trillion of market cap in Silicon Valley and a lot of wealth in California, people who work at Jack in the Box and Burger King and McDonald's, which you drive in through to get your food, and a lot of these techies are doing that, going to these places, they don't make a livable wage. They don't have predictable hours. You know, they're being told, okay, if you can't work 7 to midnight, then in 5 days a week, then you're going to not have a job. And it's technically a 40-hour week, but they're not predictable hours. Well, that is just wrong. So we're creating a state council that would give workers the power to both set wages, set predictable hours and benefits. And, you know, we've had a hard time to get the governor to sign it, so we're doing rallies with SEIU, and we're pushing for it to pass the Senate. It's passed the Assembly. So I would argue both that we need massive investment to bring costs down and improve the production, but then we also need to increase the wages of the working and middle class. And that way they would be able to afford some of the new technologies that we need.
A question from online. CBP found a large container with the bodies of 50 dead immigrants in San Antonio, Texas. Yet our borders are closed, making migrants take drastic decisions, life or death decisions for a better future. How can we reform our immigration system? Where do we start? And that's from Sebastian Fuentes.
Well, we start by repealing Title 42. I mean, Title 42 right now. And we shouldn't hem or haw about it. Part of the problem is when we talk about immigration, we're so mealy-mouthed about it. And when they talk about the immigration, they start with strength. You know, we should start with the fact that immigrants enrich America. Not just immigrants or software engineers, immigrants who come to this country to work in agriculture, to work in hospitality, to start small businesses. We should be grateful that people want to come to America and not go to other parts of the world. That's something that is what makes us a country that is open to the heritages of people from different parts of the world. And we should not be afraid of making that point. And we should be clear on what the repeal of Title 42 means. It doesn't mean everyone gets to come. It doesn't mean that the nation doesn't have borders. It means that there's a process of asylum that people should seek. And if that process is broken, then have more people, we fund the administrative law judges, fund the people who are going to process the asylum. But to say that our country is not going to take asylum seekers, which is what Title 42 is, on a excuse of COVID, is violating the fundamental principles of this country as a place that seeks to be open to people fleeing from persecution and seeking a place of refuge. And so I think that is an argument that we need to be making louder and clearly in this country. And I know Rights and Democracy is doing it, and I know you're doing it with your own delegation, which I appreciate. And I've had those conversations with some of them. You know, so I think this is a place where you can make a difference.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about, like, when you say revitalizing American communities, and you mentioned lithium-ion battery facilities, I think of the black and brown people in Africa and all of Southeast Asia, where those parts are made, where they're mined, where like the materials are mined from. How do we as America make sure that we're not incentivizing the practice of mining as it stands today and revitalizing that industry and making sure that when we do change our economy, it's just for all people, not just here in the country, but globally?
Thank you.
It's a good question. I wouldn't do the mining in the United United States, much of the mining. I don't think we have to. And most of the mining, I think, is in Australia and in some countries in Africa. But I think the processing of the material, which is 80% done in China, can be done in the United States in ways that are environmentally much more friendly. The mining is a much more difficult issue because that legitimately has a lot of environmental concerns. And I'm reluctant to say, let's start mining this in the United States. Processing can be done in a way that isn't nearly as challenging for the mining. But the question of how do we balance, I think, is a very important question. And I guess my view is that you need an economic foundation of prosperity and jobs in a country first to build a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. That if we don't have that economic foundation in this country, we're not going to succeed in the project of bringing our country together. And I think that's evident by the politics that we've seen of the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in the last 10 years. And so as a prerequisite to a country, we have to have an economic foundation. I would argue that we need to do that globally, that, you know, the cause of the opium wars in China, and I'm not for a replication of the trade war, a Cold War with China, but the cause of the opium wars in the 1840s, where Britain was totally unjustified for invading China, but it was they were selling Indian opium because China had structural trade deficits. They weren't buying products from the West. Now that didn't justify the invasion, but it did show that the conditions of trade imbalance are detrimental to world peace. So I said to the Chinese ambassador, I said it's in both of our countries' interest to rebalance the production, that you want to have people feel employed and produce, and then you can trade. But you shouldn't be going to cheap labor or having such massive structural trade deficits. That's what has led to some of the Asian hate, the China bashing. It's not healthy for ultimate peace. And I would say the same thing. I think we should be active proponents of encouraging economic development in Africa, but it shouldn't be a great power politics, which is currently what China is doing, where they're trying to buy up in almost a soft form of colonialism African nations, and then we have people on our side saying, well, what are we doing to have interest in Africa? No, it should be, let's focus on building our production, our economy, and then maybe we can figure out how do we support initiatives for economic empowerment that people in Africa want and see for themselves, and what role can we play in that. But I think all of that works if we are strong as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy at home. And to do that, we have to start to figure out what are the jobs and opportunities for people who have seen the American dream slip away. And it's the dangerous combination is they've seen the American dream slip away at the same time that the country has changed rapidly demographically. And that, in my view, has created some of the conditions for the toxicity we see in our politics.
May I ask, though, as a follow-up? So I feel like part of Jonah's question was also talking about what the environmental impacts are for the people that are part of the mining production. Is that correct?
Africa.
And in any, I mean, mining as an industry is extractive, and it's harmful to the environment. So as we're thinking about this, both building in, you know, how it's the same way you want to make sure it's free trade. We talk about, you know, critiques aside, you know, thinking about how we are using our responsibility in our supply chain around that. Are there incentives or proposals around how we better help support our global partners in that, and how we also are building technology that might move us away from needing to do that mining to begin with? Things you might be seeing there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, look, the lithium-ion mining, which is still environmentally challenging, is much better than some of the fossil fuel extraction. But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to imagine how do we not need lithium-ion. I mean, I suppose, you know, we could come up with technology that would do that, but we don't have that technology now. I mean, the sun, which is the ultimate nuclear fusion reactor, instead of doing the nuclear fusion here, what we're trying to do is capture the sun, which is basically capturing nuclear fusion. That's how the sun is producing energy. But we want to make sure that that's in batteries, and to do that, a lot of that requires lithium ion. Some of the longer term doesn't. Now, can we create global standards for where lithium ion is mined to make sure that they don't have exploitive labor, to make sure that they're done in the most environmentally sound ways? That, I think, America, along with other countries, should lead on. That we have certain standards of how this is done and how it can be done in ways that meet environmental standards.
But, okay, so I'm going further. Sorry. So I still think about even the environmental and indigenous sovereignty here in this country, right? So we've seen this in other places where people use hydroelectricity and things like that that are part of this whole, we're moving away from fossil fuels and trying to find alternative means of creating energy. But it comes back to people not having sovereignty over their land and their ability to say, actually, we don't want you to mine here. I appreciate that you've identified we're one of the safer places, but we don't want you to impact our environment here. Is there a potential to maybe, I mean, can we say, like, fine, we'll support you in this way. We need you in 10 years to have built your just transition so that we are moving away from that? I would struggle if I was to speak with some of the water protectors to say, well, but we have to. Because they need it. When they're saying literally here in New Hampshire and in Vermont, no, stop. Like, just stop. Because there are so many other environmental impacts that this has. And as the sovereign people, we feel we should have a say in that. So I'm curious on how we balance that. I know it's complex.
Yeah, well, I think we do have to give them a say, and that's what the NEPA law does. It currently gives them a say on the environmental impacts of these projects. But the question is, in the mining, I would not, recommend in the United States, because I think that would run into a lot of environmental concerns. The processing, I don't think in terms of plants you could do that in places that doesn't impact community. I mean, I think that's not quite as negative for the environment in terms of the industrial processing. Now, the hydropower, I mean, that's a challenge. I mean, we have that hydro plant from Canada that is supposed to come all the way down to Massachusetts, and it would create and generate alternative energy, but there's been a lot of opposition to it.
Correct.
I don't know all the details of that, but that's something I don't think you can just ride roughshod over communities that may have environmental concerns. I think you have to build consensus for those projects, and then...
What if they say no?
Well, then you have to do it somewhere else. I mean, then you do it somewhere else. I mean, then... or you have to have the massive compensation that they agree to. I mean, but I don't think you can just, through eminent domain, or say, well, we don't want these environmental protections. We're a big country. I think we can figure out how to be producing solar farms, wind farms, hydro in ways that are also respectful of communities. Right. But I don't think we're at a point where these things are getting blocked in every community, and we're not having solar farms or wind farms or offshore wind or hydropower be built anywhere. Now, that would be a problem. I mean, obviously, we can't solve climate if we stopped building all of renewables. So at some point, we have to make choices, and we have to say that the climate is our biggest challenge, and we have to build solar and wind and hydro capacity, or an electric renewable electric vehicles, or we're never going to solve climate. But it should be done with as much sensitivity of local communities as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm not sure where we're at on time. We're good on time? Okay, good. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you for speaking out in favor of immigration and against Title 42. Not all Democrats around here do that, and it's important. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your voice.
Yeah. My other question was about transportation generally. We've heard a bit about electric cars, and I think they're a great step, but they're still cars, they still have a drawback, they still create a lot of traffic. I'm partial to e-bikes myself and getting people into alternate forms of transportation. We certainly don't have enough buses around here. What are some things we can do? How can that be supported on a federal level so that we can have the infrastructure to support e-bikes, to support better pedestrian uses, so we don't have to have so many cars coming into town, so that there's other ways that people can can meet their transportation needs.
I think it's a great point. One of the things I proposed to the White House is a simple thing we could do with gas prices so high is to make transit free, or to provide people with help to go get on a bus or go get on a train, and to massively subsidize that so that people may encourage a change of behavior. Certainly we should have much more funding for safe bike lanes, for pedestrian paths, for creating e-bikes, for looking at all of the forms of transportation that can reduce the need for always being in an automobile. We're not going to realistically be able to do that for all parts of the country. I mean, there are people who live in rural communities who drive in, there are people who drive long distances, so the automobile, in terms of the foreseeable future, is also going to be with us, which is why I think we need to move to electrical, hydrogen automobiles as one source of tackling climate. But I would have an all of the above approach that would also simultaneously encourage the much better public pedestrian walking areas, much better bike lanes, much more subsidy for those transportation means, so that we can recognize that we don't need all these cars everywhere in every city.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. One more question? Anyone else? Do you have one online?
No, ma'am, please.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, in light of the Supreme Court's poor ethical conduct, authority of progressive decisions, most recently, of course, the decision overturning Roe versus Wade that is very much on all of our minds right now. What can we do to counter the deep, deep harms that this rogue judicial branch is causing?
We need to reform the court. I mean, we've got to, first of all, we need to campaign against the court. We need to stop pretending that it's some august body with deliberation. And these are partisan hacks in many places that have been put on the court. And I think we've given it too much deference. You know, you go read, because I'm a student of history, you go read how Lincoln talked about the court. And he would talk about, you know, the attorneys' conflicts of interest. And he was very vocal. And I think from the president on down, they need to be exposing the court. I've said, in the past, I've said that the people who ran campaigns to get onto the Supreme Court, because that was what it was a political campaign, ran more dishonest campaigns than most of my colleagues run to get to Congress. And that's saying something. And they ought to be hauled before the Senate for lying to the Senate. And we ought to have hearings on it and put pressure on it. Even if they don't have the votes, start putting pressure to expose the court. Because the courts in this country tend to move when there's mobilization and political pressure. That's what happened with FDR. The courts flipped. They were striking down old New Deal legislation under the Lochner era, and then they switched. And the more we campaign against the courts, the more we expose them for the political actors that they are. So Justice Sotomayor says the stench of politics is on our court. The stench of politics. Every Democrat should be saying that. Quoting Justice Sotomayor, these are political actors. They're not judges. The stench of politics is on that court. And I think that's what they fear. They don't want to be, they have the robe ripped off and exposed as partisan actors. And part of we could talk about proposals, whether it's my term limits proposal, whether it's a proposal to have hearings, but part of it is I don't think we're going strong enough rhetorically against the court. Actually, I think Elizabeth Warren has been one of the strongest voices since the decision in making that point, that there is a legitimacy crisis. Now, she has the advantage of being a Harvard law professor and really understanding the jurisprudence, and a brilliant thinker. But we need, I think if the Democratic Party could get on that message, that will put the type of pressure. And I think it's what grassroots Democrats across the country want. They want some fight in standing up for the gross injustice that has taken place.
I think that 90% of the American people knew that the people coming into the Supreme Court were being dishonest. How could the Senate not see that?
You know, it's convenient. Sometimes it's, I forget the phrase, where it's sort of convenient blindness, you know, where you're blind to something out of convenience because your political interests are so strong to be blind to it. And I think that's what happened in the case of Susan Collins and some of the others. They didn't want to dig deeper. They wanted to vote with the Republican. And this is where not exposing the court as political actors, as providing too much deference to it, has done us a disservice. Because if we just treat it like it's the Congress or the Senate and make it or the presidency, that these aren't some exalted, deliberative human beings. It's unfortunate because they're supposed to be. There are times in our country's history where they have been. And I'm not saying the Supreme Court was an illegitimate entity. I'm saying right now this particular court has lost legitimacy. Now maybe we can reform it and have other people, and that doesn't mean the decisions always have to go the way I want them to go. But they can't be decisions that are fundamentally unjust, that are fundamentally taking away rights. This is a tarnished court. And that is what we have to be much more vocal about and much clearer about. I have tremendous admiration for Vice President Gore, but we've got to stop the speech he gave after the concession. Maybe it was appropriate then, it's not appropriate now. This is not a court that is a court that ought to be seen as anything other than political actors. And that is, you know, that is, I think, something we all can do as Americans. And when we do that, we will win, because the mobilized American public ultimately has won, both in terms of post Dred Scott and post Plessy and in the civil rights. It's often a long fight, but the immobilized American public cannot be stopped. And that, I think, is why when people say they're disappointed about Sanders' loss or the progressive loss and the frustrations, I say we have to keep going, because we've made a tremendous amount of progress. Tremendous amount of progress. We're sort of, you know, as Nelson Mandela says, it always seems impossible until it's done. And we're closer than we realize. But we just have to keep fighting.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Congressman Ro Khanna so much.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you so much.